Hello, everybody. How's it going? Thank you all so much for coming out tonight. My name is Tim Anderson. I'm programming coordinator here. And this is National Science on Screen Night mashup cult classic. John Woo's, I don't even know, legendary, crazy, nuts. It's Face Off, baby. So we're very excited about it. So you guys who have been here know Enzian's 35mm Cult Classics series happens about twice a month, 4 times in October, presenting films in 35mm. And once a year we get to do this in conjunction with the National Science on Screen Night and the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation. So I'm going to take a moment to let you guys know that Science on Screen, which is a program we do 4 times a year, the rest of them are on the weekends during the daytime. As opposed to you people who have no lives and it's to 9 o'clock on a Tuesday. I love you. Science on Screen is made possible through the Coolidge Corner Theatre with funding from the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation. The purpose of Science on Screen is to enhance film and scientific literacy by pairing films with presentations by notable experts. Without further ado, then, I would like to invite to the stage our guest this evening, Dr. Marguerite Barnett, and she is going to talk to you about the science behind this completely insane film. So
it's a pleasure to be here tonight. I'm Marguerite Barnett. I'm a surgeon. I'm over in Sarasota, but I drove all this way to be with you tonight. I'm not a transplant surgeon. I joke that I'm a proto-transplant surgeon. I was double boarded in general and plastic surgery, and I attended a very expensive medical school, the joint Harvard-MIT Health Sciences and Technology program. And in order to afford that, I went through the military on an Army scholarship and I paid that back by 11 years of active duty. So thank all of you taxpayers out there for helping me to get the good education. Now, I'm a lot older than I look. I am a plastic surgeon, so a little bit of Botox. No, anyway. So I actually was, transplant surgery was not in its infancy, but what I would call adolescence by the time I got out. And, it was limited at that time mostly to cadaver, heart, and kidney transplants. And I was a trauma surgeon in the military, so I had the unfortunate and not uncommon experience of attending deaths. And my job was I would harvest organs for the transplant surgeons. Nowadays, it's an entirely different thing. They have their own teams. But I did have an interest in this, and one of my professors at medical school was Dr. Joe Murray, who was the 1990 Nobel Prize winner in physiology and medicine. He shared that with Dr. Thomas for their contributions to cell and organ transplantation. And I identified with him because we had some similar career paths, only I'm never going to win a Nobel Prize, but he was very tall and courtly and extremely generous and sweet to medical students, which a lot of the big guys couldn't be bothered to talk to us, so I appreciated that a lot. And besides both of us attending HMS, we wound up in the military. He was drafted in World War II, and I did my service to pay for my medical education. But I think these kind of experiences, like many surgeons, we were exposed in the military to unusual deforming injuries. And this prompted both Dr. Murray and me to be very interested in reconstructive surgery. Now, he went on to perform the world's first successful renal transplants between identical twins, the Hendrick twins, in 1954, which was the year that I was born, so I'm dating myself here. And in 1959, he performed the first allograft transplant. Now, we're going to give you a little background on what these things mean. Identical twins share the same genetic materials, so you don't have to worry about them rejecting each other's organs. That's how he was able to do that in 54. And in 59, though, he transplanted an organ between someone who did not share the identical genetic information, and that was made possible only by the ability for us to suppress the immune system. In 1962, he did the world's first cadaveric renal transplant, taking it from a dead person. And obviously you have 2 kidneys, so people can do living kidney donations, and the liver is able to regenerate itself, so you can actually take part of the liver and do transplants to people in living donors, but the expansion to people who had already died really opened up the availability of organs and the ability to save lives now. Now, Dr. Murray was a really humble guy, and he used to say, "We stand on the shoulders of giants." He did not invent this saying. I mean, I've traced that back quite some ways. We're not sure who says that, but when you have amazing things that can happen, like we don't even think anymore about transplants of the heart or lungs, and you probably even know somebody who's had such a transplant, but it doesn't happen in a vacuum. These things, as with most science and technological advances, start with minor things that don't seem like much, but they all add up, and they lead to incredible things that we're able to do. So let me just start out here. Now, how many of you guys need trigger warning for like gross pictures? All right, okay. I'll try to remember to give you trigger warnings. We surgeons have these really weird ideas. I was giving a lecture to the Elks for breakfast on a nose reconstruction using a toe, which which led to all the jokes. If your nose runs and your feet smell, you must be upside down. But I cleaned it up because I thought, oh, this is breakfast, and these are not people like us. We make jokes and compare tumors to food. So I made the mistake of saying, this next slide is not really bad, and it was this kid with this gaping hole in his nose, and people were throwing up, and then I realized how twisted we people are. So I'll try to remember to give you guys a little trigger warning. All right, so facial transplantation, Hollywood versus in real life. We always feel like we've invented amazing things, but I want to tell you that actually the ancients were pretty good at stuff. I mean, human anatomy, the brain hasn't changed a whole lot in millennia, but my understanding, for example, in ancient Egypt, the punishment for being caught in adultery was to cut the tip of your nose off. Now, this is something that's really hard to hide, and so the ancient surgeons of Egypt had actually devised an amazing way in which they just moved some skin off of the forehead down and covered the tips of the nose. And this was something in 1500 BC, so it's really humbling to think that these guys were able to do complete nasal reconstructions. And these techniques were totally lost for centuries until this was from the 1500s. An Italian Dr. Tagliacozzi invented ways of moving tissue from elsewhere to cover these sort of defects. So this is his little harness, and he's lifted a bit of skin off of the upper inner arm, and he sews it onto this raw gaping wound, and after a period of time, blood flow gets reestablished. It's a surprisingly quick process, and after 10 days, you're actually able to cut that little pedicle off of the arm, release the arm, and then you can sew that tip down and form a nasal tip. And again, these techniques were forgotten for centuries until they were resurrected probably like the turn of the 1900s, the turn of the 20th century. And I think some of the things that you have to understand is, hold on a second. Yeah, you don't have to worry about trigger warning for this one, hopefully. So these were the techniques that facial reconstructive surgeons had. And this is like a slide from the 1950s in which, you can see these pedicle tubes that are being moved up. This woman had a defect from a burn, which was, very deforming to that side of her face, and you can see the final result looks very natural. And the defect, you can see her arm has been put up to bring this up, and the defect on the arm was pretty easy to hide. And you can actually move these, they call them waltzing pedicles. So, for example, this slide demonstrates a pedicle that's lifted off of the belly, attached to the arm, and the arm is attached to the leg. So you could move big bits of tissue quite a distance, but it took time. These waltzing pedicles, there was actually an apocryphal story that we heard about in plastic surgery fellowship that somebody had gotten lost to follow-up in the middle of these pedicles being designed, and I tracked it down, and this was an actual true story. Apparently a woman in London around beginning of World War II was undergoing these pedicled reconstructions of facial burns, and then when the Blitz happened, she was evacuated out to the country and lost to follow-up to Dr. Mickendoe, who was one of the pioneers of facial plastic surgery. 40 years later, this woman showed up with complications related to the burns on her face, and the people that were there noted that she had this pedicle on her belly, which for orientation, that's the belly button there on the left of the screen, and you can see this little tube of tissue that's been raised up. And so they offered to take care of that, and she was like, "No, I really like it. I tuck my handkerchiefs and things in that." You never know what's going to happen. It wasn't an apocryphal story, but the best that we could do was to have these composite things that kind of just sat on the face like lumps. And, while it was better than nothing, and particularly World War I let me back up. Military surgeons get a lot of experience, and there's been this really incestuous thing between plastic surgery and the military, because in the military world, we're exposed to these unique traumas. In World War I, it was trench warfare, so people would peek up over the trench and immediately get shot in the face. And those that survived had really horrible defects. It was difficult to go back into society with half of your face missing. So these are just some composite pictures of the state-of-the-art from World War I, which again is better than having a hole in your face, but doctors have always been on the lookout for something better. And particularly if you have an area where you're going to get a complication if you have a wound that's left open. Now I'm going to give those of you with the weak stomach a trigger warning. This next one, just turn your eyes, shut your eyes, or do like I do when I watch scary movies, peek through it. It's a little better. So this is an injury that we see not uncommonly when people get into a bad motorcycle accident, and it's an open tibial fibular fracture. And you can put the bones together with steel plates, but unless you have some good vascularized tissue over this, it's going to invariably get infected. And you could walk these pedicles down off the belly, but that's going to take several weeks to get that area covered, and in the meantime it will get infected. So what you're seeing in the middle picture there is what is called a free vascularized flap. We've taken a muscle off of the back, the latissimus dorsi muscle. This is the one where, the bodybuilders go like this and it flares out like a cobra. You can live without that, and we rob Peter to pay Paul. It's this really nice, it's a nice hunk of flesh. And you can put this over the thing and hook it up under the microscope with these little vessels, and it will live there and put good blood flow. You can cover it with a skin graft. So on the far side, you see early stages before the skin graft is faded out. That's a pretty good result, and we just really wasn't able to do that. This was the state where we were at when I was in my training, and the guys called it taking the elevator versus the stairs. They were very excited about this. But of course, another thing that you couldn't really do with any, is trigger warning, sorry. Fingers are off, you know. There's just no way to put pedicles, but you just have these little stumpy things. They're not very good at holding stuff. So this is where microvascular surgery, and microvascular surgery is one of the main legs of what I call facial transplantation. Because you may not be aware, here, let me switch real fast so we can get off of the gory stuff. This is just a slide of those microvascular instruments. You have to have very delicate instruments. The actual sutures that we use to close tiny blood vessels are thinner than hairs. And, I loved microvascular surgery. I wanted to do it, but I was in the military and surgery, which is kind of a masculine world, and I was sort of frozen out. They really didn't want me. And, to this day, even though I was very disappointed at the time, I'm grateful because you have a limited lifespan as a microvascular surgeon. You have to have very good eyesight. You cannot drink coffee at all. And I would just die now if I couldn't have a little bit of coffee. This, when you're under the microscope, this coffee gives you a little tremor. It looks like a hurricane's going on there under there. So most microvascular surgeons do not make it to the ripe old age that I do. So I'm at least in something where I can have a little worse life, a little easier lifestyle. But these little microvascular clamps that you're looking at up in the far right are smaller than a dime. So that just gives you a little idea of the scale. Surgeons back in India were able to use fine sutures like hairs and things like that. So that wasn't the problem. But you might be surprised to know that prior to the development of microvascular surgery in the 1900s, the only treatments we had for vascular injury were either ligation, you tied off the artery, or you amputated. If you are familiar with the Civil War, for example, if you had an injury to your leg, a femur fracture, they didn't even try to save it, they just cut it off. The best surgeons had a start to finish time of 3.5 minutes. They were able to complete that. Because if you tied off those arteries, usually the invariable result would be that the leg would die, you'd have this horrible gangrenous mass, and people would die of infection. So the second leg of transplantation was the development of wonderful antibiotics and also what we call the chemotherapies to prevent rejection, suppression of the immune system. But just to give you an idea of some of these little anastomoses, this is looking under the microscope at these tiny little clamps, which are, as I said, about the size of a dime. So you can see this blood vessel is about 3.5 to 4 millimeters, and those sutures are so small that you would not be able to see them unless they're under the microscope. And here's one of my colleagues from William Beaumont Medical Center doing microvascular surgery. You can see the setup with the microscope. I found that rather bulky. I had really good eyes, so I actually used a 6x loop because I didn't have to constantly focus it. But the other problem with just ligating things is lack of blood flow was also when you're dealing with repairing small vessels, clots can lead to the lack of blood flow, and then the tissue will die. So my next slide is a slide of something that revolutionized microvascular surgery, which are leeches. And I remember the first finger replant I did at the little hospital in Sarasota where I'm at. The patient called the newspaper because he couldn't believe that I put leeches on him. And so I was inundated with interview requests from all the second graders who thought this was the most amazing thing. And when we gave the in-service on how to apply the leeches, the nurses were lined up in the, outside the room. I must have counted about 5 dozen nurses hanging out and looking at this thing. And anyway, these different things made possible the ability to put small arteries together And the leeches were important to get the old blood out so the new blood could come in. After a while, within 3 days, the veins will reopen, anastomosis will reopen. So a little trigger warning we have. This was the first full facial transplant. A 9-year-old in India got her pigtails caught in a threshing machine, and it took everything off. Now, this is what we call a composite graft. It has hair, it's got skin, it has the nasal cartilages, and her mother had the presence of mind to take this in a plastic bag with ice. They were able to replant it, and this is her as an adult. She actually became a nurse because of her interests. Now, this patient did not have to go on anti-rejection medications, but that's been the limiting thing about face transplants. Let me go to the next slide so you don't have to look at that one any longer. The big thing with face transplants, when you're dealing with these strong medications to suppress the immune system, you can die of overwhelming infections. Frequently, these medicines destroy your kidney, and there's just a lot of unpleasant side effects. So I think when you're talking about a heart, a lung, or a liver, no one argues that that isn't. You must have those to live, but you can live without a face. So there was quite a lot of talk, even though this Indian child was replanted in 1994, and I would bet that face-off is a direct thing from this report in the news, because that came out, I believe, in '97. You know, this sort of thing just grabs everybody's attention. But when you're talking about doing something for looks, you can live without a face. So there was a lot of ethical discussion, and in fact, facial transplants were delayed in the United States. There was one Dr. Barker who took over the microvascular fellowship that I trained at from Kleinert, and he was very much going to do this, and yet the ethics committee said, you can't do this, it's too dangerous for the patients. Paris was planning to do the same thing, but they were having the same issues, actually a little more difficult. My understanding is they have more of a socialized medicine thing, and they did not want to spend the money on these patients. So while they were arguing about it, a private hospital in France, not the Paris guys, actually went ahead with the very first one, and that was in, I believe, 2005, and Isidore Janor fell asleep, had taken a lot of sleeping pills, and her dog ate her face off. Now, I'm not going to put her pictures up, but she received a successful face transplant. These are 15-hour operations, and it take 18 surgeons and teams of physical therapists. And so this was the first one done in the United States. This was Connor, I forget her name, but she tried to kill herself, and as is often the case, if you don't point the gun right straight back, you just blow the front of your face off. Now, interestingly, I took care of many of these patients, and none of them wanted to kill themselves afterwards. Now, I would have wanted to kill myself without a face, but it seemed to do something to their brains so that all the ones I met wanted to live. But you can see in the middle picture, this is the best we could do with flaps, and that's not really socially acceptable. So the far picture is her after her full facial transplant. Now, the one thing that makes face-off unrealistic from the science point of view is the working of a nerve. Unfortunately, even though nerves do have some electrical activity, it's not like an electrical wire where you hook it up and it immediately begins to work. So it has to regrow. The nerve dies back to the cell body, which is at the base of the skull and the face. When I was doing hand replants, that's all the way here, and those stupid nerves regrow about 1 millimeter a day. So you can do the math. It takes a long time for those nerves to be regenerated, a lot less time for the face. So apparently many of these patients are able to make some smiles and stuff, but you know, that's the one thing about the movie where immediately he looked normal. It takes physical therapy, and they don't always look normal. This one I just included because it was one of the few where I could show you the pre-injury. This was, oh gosh, I'm blanking on the name, but he again also tried to kill himself. You can see what we were able to accomplish with pedicles, and the gentleman underneath to the far right is the donor. So people want to know, who do they look like? Do they look like the donor or do they look like themselves? And he's the one on this side before his injury. And on the far right up there, that's him after he got back some reanimation of his face. And typically the nose looks like the donor because that's the cartilage, but the bone structure is what really gives you the facial features. So they're an interesting mixture of the two of those sort of things. So what else can I say about it? We enjoy the movies. I have no doubt that we might be someday able to make the nerves work right away without them having to die, but currently we don't have that ability. So that's the rate limiting thing. To date, we're up over 47 facial transplants. Again, the lifespan of these patients is limited. For solid organs like heart, typically it's 13 years survival after transplantation, and people can be retransplanted. And 10 years if it's a cadaver kidney. We don't know yet with the face, since most of these were done, interestingly, in a kind of burst of time between 2008 and 2018. And most of them were done by two surgeons. One was Boden, who is at the Brigham Hospital in Boston, and another was Dr. Lantieri in Paris. And I found out a little bit about that. Apparently the US Army has been funding a lot. These are expensive surgeries, over $500,000 just to perform this surgery, and that doesn't even count the amount of physical therapy and follow-up, constant monitoring of the medicines to make sure they're not getting side effects. And so they're probably going to be similar lifespan, since it's not as critical as a heart if it fails. We have had one that has been retransplanted, and that's Robert Chelsea, this one. I forgot. He lost his graft at one point, had to be retransplanted. So it's interesting stuff. I hope you enjoy the movie, and any questions? Stunned silence, yes. I'm not sure that it has. I really don't. Other than you could have a specialist who's like, a continent away guiding you. That would be the big advantage. But I've just not, I'm trying to think there. These little anastomoses are difficult to see because under the microscope it's two-dimensional, so you have to be very careful that you're not sewing the back wall in. Some people have devised little like staple things where you just kind of put the vein over it and then clip it together with magnets, and those have increased our speed of doing it, but I'm just not sure the robotics are at that point yet where they're going to, at least maybe for another decade.
Are maggots still used to clean out gangrene?
Yes, but the nurses hate them, so most of us are now using enzymatic debridement because they don't like the maggots. Any other questions? Again, thanks for having me, and